Welcome to another episode of the Monte and Wolf Show. We finally finished the regular season, Wolf, and what will be no doubt a thrilling playoff bracket is before us that surely Genji won't easily win this time, right, Wolf?
I think they easily win it this time.
That's okay. It just we're hyping ourselves up for the golden road at Worlds. It doesn't matter if they easily win it. But before we do that, we will do our typical end of split eulogies for the teams that didn't make playoffs. Amongst these shitters, where would you like to begin?
Let's start with Bro.
Where to go from the bottom up?
Yeah. So
All right.
I feel like, you know, the fans for Bro have been awesome. That one guy who yelled really loud from the crowd was pretty awesome. I feel like Edgar has had some decent draft plans for the squad that the team couldn't execute on. Otherwise, I feel like the team showed no measurable or quantifiable growth as a unit, and that's really disappointing to me. Picking up Fate was smart. I feel like he, by existing, was better than what we had before, because Pulbay played like 2 games and didn't look great. And I've talked about Karas to death, not really on this show, fortunately for everyone, but I do think Karas' time has passed. I feel like his window to be a relevant mid laner in the LCK has passed. And then you have Morgan, who had one of his worst seasons that he's had in his career. Young Jay is fine, but there's just not really a whole lot going on. And then Envy, I think he had potential. Like when he was on Sandbox, I thought, okay, he's got some potential.
Varus is all right.
Yeah, decent Varus. Lucian was decent. Zeri was pretty good. But when he's on this roster, I feel like maybe he just can't get motivated. He doesn't feel good about, how the rest of the roster is pretty not great. And then he also is not playing well. Paulo is probably the best part of this roster on his best day, but on his recent days, he hasn't been having a lot of those. Honestly, this roster just needs to get blown up and they need to start over. But instead, they'll probably just buy a 4th mid laner that doesn't make any sense, and that's what we get instead. Maybe we'll get Vikla or something. We'll be like, what is even happening? Why do you guys have Vikla?
The Vikla downgrading continues across the world. Look, man, I have not been impressed with this roster. I'll give them some credit that they at least tried to get better by pulling Fate, who hadn't been playing on a team this year, into this team into summer, at least in a somewhat of a bid to improve. Shout out to Brion for beating KT. That was random and exciting. So they did have a couple of important wins, but I mean, what are we really doing with this team? I agree with you, Wolf. Like, why are we continuing to watch them? They are pretty trash. And I said this last season, but it is disappointing that they let go, because the only thing that was exciting about them last year was that they were able to compete in the early game because of and then you would watch to see in which fashion they would spectacularly throw. We don't even have that. This team has basically robbed us of all entertainment, and they robbed the Guangdong Freaks of a potential playoff spot again. So they're just there to ruin the hype for other teams very occasionally and have virtually no redeeming qualities of themselves. Now, people just like to meme them as being the bros and the Giga Chads, but they're not. They're trash. They deserve to be fully eliminated from this league. Wolf, I'll go further. I don't hope they blow up the roster. I hope the league blows them up and we go to 8 teams and Brion isn't one of them next year.
I mean, that's a possibility. We don't know what the format's going to look like. We might have relegation instead, where we have teams that don't even exist at this moment in time competing to try to get into Brion's spot. Look, Brion got the OK Savings Bank sponsor, which I don't know how much cash that was, but at least that was a big influx of potential money after they lost the Reddit sponsor.
I feel like yogurt sponsorship. Why?
Yeah, well, I just don't think they have the backing to make a real roster. They just don't have it. I don't know what to tell you guys. There's no money, so I feel like all of their players are on minimum salary. I would probably say the same about Nongshim. And that's okay, but it means you're not going to be competitive, right? And that's not what people are looking forward to watching. So maybe they can get some funding if they're going to stay in the LCK next season. And I guess that brings us to talking about I was gonna say Nongshim because they're in the similar
Sure.
boat, but it's actually DRX if we're going up the list. Uh, DRX.
Shout out to DRX's bot lane. You guys are actually pretty good. Teddy popped off towards the end of the split. Pleta definitely deserves to be on a better team.
Yes.
You know what? Well, they ended with an upset over Kwangdong, like, ending the hopes of Kwangdong's playoff run. So, like, I honestly thought DRX was kind of looking better the deeper they went into summer. Not that they're good, they're still trash, but at least there were some bright spots or for some fun players to watch. I'll say that. Rascal's a fucking bum, though. Rascal can retire, by the way. I wish Rascal would retire. Rascal is a 1v1 lane guy who actually just is one of the worst team players I have ever seen. He's a KDA player to the hilt. And I am so tired of watching this guy do well in lane and then not give a flying fuck about the rest of the game.
His KDA is not so good right now also. So it's pretty much all but confirmed that he's going to go to the military next year. So he's pretty confirmed to retire. It's not confirmed, but he's kind of alluded to it, and that's basically the fan sentiment that like this was his last game that he did play. So I do think we won't be seeing him for a while. Maybe he'll come back as a coach or go to another, minor region or something after the military. But yeah, he was one of my favorite players to watch years ago.
Yes.
But has significantly fallen off. I think Pleta obviously has a lot of potential. I do wonder if he could have like his own Delight-esque arc where, he was trapped on Bro and then went to Genji and Hanwha and stuff. I think I thought Teddy had a pretty good start to the season, and then he had a few like random pop-off games, like the Kaisa game that everyone remembers, where he carried the Baron team fight. But otherwise, like played a bunch of Xayah, which is not acceptable in my mind, and really fell off towards like the middle to later half. I do feel like at the very end, like he had a game or two that were pretty fine.
Yeah, he did have a couple games at the very end.
Yehu was pretty impressive at times. Like he definitely was no longer a Hui one trick. I do think he improved his play significantly. We saw Setab come in against Kwangdong and have like good Yone game. I don't really want to say great things about Setab off of just one like last minute sub in a game that didn't matter for them. But he looked better than he did at the beginning of the season, which was atrocious. So that's something, I guess. Sponge, I feel like, is the only person who showed real growth. Like Setab, really rough, right? You had Yehu who showed like a little bit of growth, but I feel like Sponge had real measurable growth. And then Pleta is like he didn't grow that much. He was already like good before and he was good again. So I don't feel like he had that much growth, but he was very good and arguably the most consistent best player on the team throughout the season and probably the year. But yeah, I actually thought this roster, based on their performances in like week 1, week 2, would maybe have like a cool arc where they could be like the last playoffs team or be like where Kwangdong is right now. But no. Rest in peace. And feels really bad the way Rascal had to go out, but he probably should have been replaced by Frog way earlier in the season, and they should have tried to build around Frog because they were like, "Oh, Frog, like come in against like one of the best teams. Oh, you lost. I guess we have to play Rascal again." No, just actually commit. Like do the Moham thing. You have to do it early this time because Frog's a rookie. But no, they didn't do it, and then we were all really sad. And Rascal won like one series the whole year. So there you go. Who's next? Nongshim?
Noodle Boys.
Nongshim got better at the end.
Look, I appreciate that Nongshim was improving, and I appreciate a lot of the risks that they took, a lot of the roster mix-ups that they went through. You know what I mean? Like, Fisher's not a good player, but they were willing to even like do a minor upgrade at the mid lane position. And then also, I mean, they've been running experiments like taking Vital, who is a role swapped player, and Vital actually, did look good. And they put him into the academy, switched his role, and then brought him back up to the LCK, which is like pretty cool. And I thought he had a lot of, good games. Guger pretty, or I mean, Jiwoo, pretty all right, right? I think Jiwoo, one of the more promising players. Sylvie, for the last couple of years, I think has been a halfway decent jungler, and then they've been switching around Dundun and Mihail, it's another swap out that seemed to have brought life to this team. So Nongshim, at least, I felt like was trending in the right direction. They obviously beat T1 in the past couple of weeks. They took a game off Dplus, so they were looking a lot more legit, I have to say.
Yeah. And before it was just, I mean, it's crazy to think about. Sylvie's the only remnant now of like the original Challengers roster, and everyone else has kind of moved around. It was really interesting to think about that when you consider how much Sylvie has grown and how each individual part that has been changed feels like a minor upgrade that then kind of got molded into a major upgrade. I'm not saying these are major upgrades in the sense that this is going to be a playoffs team, but compared to what it was before, like Vital over, I hate to say it, like Peter, is a pretty huge upgrade in terms of what he's been able to offer to the team right now. And then, settling on Fisher in the mid lane feels like a good middle ground compared to like some really high highs, but equally, if not higher lows from players like Calmy and Calix. And then Mihail is a measured improvement over Dindin. So yeah, Mihail was kind of like a Cassante one trick, but so was Dindin. So, but then Mihail actually played other champions and did all right with them. Whereas Dindin, if he wasn't playing Cassante, he was showing a really, really bad performance, honestly, most of the time. And when he was playing Cassante, he was showing at best a mediocre performance. So I do think Dindin is a very creative player and a very fun player, but maybe, isn't suited for like a, actually might be better suited for like a coaching role or potentially even like a drafting role or maybe like a streamer role within this team. I just don't think that the pro scene is necessarily for him. But yeah, I mean, Nongshim, they punched up a lot at the end, and they kind of had some of the old bro energy. You know what I mean? Like they had some of the
Yeah.
old like umpty bro roster energy where it would sometimes take a game or a series away from a top team because they came up with a good plan. They played really clutch. They had a good early game, and then Geo is that late game insurance policy that you have. So I don't know what's going to happen with this roster. Like they could, if we go to 8 teams, they could be one of the teams that doesn't make it in next year. Obviously, they have a ton of funding because Nongshim is one of the biggest food brands.
Yeah,
in
a
Korea.
multi-billion-dollar company.
Yeah. So like, if they wanted to spend, they could, and they could build a real competitive roster, and they could make a case like, hey, no, I'm staying in the LCK. Again, if we go to 8, which is not confirmed, but I don't know what's going to happen because they've clearly shown that since the 2022 disaster roster, everyone remembers the Ghost, Dread, BDD, Kana, like it had a lot of really great pieces, but that roster was an absolute disaster. It was an expensive waste, basically. I think the company was like, hey, like let's not spend that much money on esports because like we got all the good like famous players, and then I mean they were all like misfit famous players, but they were like pretty good players. And then it just completely bombed and everyone was miserable and that roster really didn't do it. I think they were like, all right, minimum salary, we'll go challengers, like let's build for the future. Or just like, I don't know, maybe the LCK buy was a
Yeah,
mistake.
but like I think what's interesting about Nongshim is unlike the other bad teams that have not been able to build good rosters, like having Vital do the role swap and look as good as he has shows, a certain amount of foresight and planning and an ability to take risks and an ability to identify what makes a player good. I just think Nongshim has had better development players overall compared to a lot of these other weaker teams.
Yeah, I mean they've been basically the best challengers squad at finding good players for a few years now. Like their challengers teams have always been incredibly competitive. I think now that they found a good middle ground with bringing those challengers players into LCK, it dropped down a little bit in challengers because those players are in the LCK
Sure.
now, but
Right.
they had a really nice system for going from academy and scouting and solo queue and stuff to challengers and then push that into the LCK, which again we've talked about a little bit here on this show, and I love Chronicler, but the difference between like challengers and LCK is a massive gap at the moment.
Right.
So I mean, I'm giving Chronicler shit because he always like I would say overhypes sometimes the players coming into challengers and then they come into LCK and kind of get booty blasted. But um, I do think that there's the development pipeline in Korea, we're very weak there. Like we don't have a lot of up and coming talent, but Nongshim had a lot of that talent. They've utilized it pretty well, all things considered. It's much easier to just have like a otherwise fully functioning veteran roster and then slot Lucid in than to actually try to pull like all challengers players up into LCK and have this amalgamation that Nongshim had. So I think they did a pretty good job. And I think that there was real measurable growth. Like, bro, no, absolutely no measurable growth. Like I feel like they're the just as bad, as they were at the beginning as they are now, essentially, which is sad. But Nongshim, you can actually feel like they made some small incremental improvements to the roster and then ended up with a better product, a better team in the end.
All right. Final team.
Guangdong Freaks.
Guangdong. I mean, here's the thing. Serious question watching this year. Do we actually hate Guangdong? Like, sure, they disappointed. This is a team that should have done better in both spring and summer. They couldn't actually make it to the finish line. They overperformed in the first round robin, massively underperformed in the second round robin in both spring and summer. But Wolf, they did sign Cuz, and Cuz was their best player this year. Like, do we hate this organization? Because honestly, they have had some promising talent, right? Cuz was an amazing get for them after him leaving KT and looking so good last year, and he continued to be good for much of this year. Now we can talk about Bulldog and Leaper, maybe, not having, Bull and Leaper not having potentially the longevity, but how much of that, my question would be like, how much of that is CV Max's fault, expecting Leaper, who's coming off a content creation career as a rookie, having to do wacky things like play Talia in the bot lane? Like, how much of their scrim and practice time was spent on this stuff instead of making him a standard AD carry? Did that hinder his development in some ways? And then we have, Andil being, I think, a legit kind of up and coming support talent, even though he has, mental fortitude or health issues or whatever keeps him out of certain games. Bulldog, I really actually just don't like Bulldog because I think he's never going to improve in lane and that he can only play one or two champions at a given time. And sure, he can play them at an acceptable level and his kind of mid game is fine and his late game is better than his early game, but I'm not sure if this is a long-term solution. And Dudu has been pretty solid for the most part this year. So where do we put these guys? Because I feel like Guangdong, in spite of the fact that I feel like people get disappointed by them because of the hype that they've built for themselves in early spring and summer, but that has come off of good play. And given the money that's being spent on this roster, are we really angry about their placement? Because at least they're competitive, unlike the last three that we talked about.
Yeah, I it's similar to KT, but in a different way in that that this team at its best can be a strong playoff contender, right? And they've shown that, and there's some good drafting, and sometimes you walk away from a Guangdong series and you go, damn, that's some good play right there. Like, there's something here. But 3/4 of the time, or maybe 2/3 of the time, you watch it and you go, there's nothing here. What the fuck is this draft? They have no plan. What's going on? And I think that's the most frustrating part of this. Is CV Max has basically been told, this is how I look at it from the outside looking in. Guangdong also, by the way, massive pharmaceutical org, basically.
Yes.
They make a bunch of, I don't want to call it pseudoscience products, but they have barley tea type stuff and some supplements.
It's not pseudoscience. So Guangdong sells pharmaceuticals, and because Korea, there is no antitrust in Korea. Basically, they also sell what Wolf's referring to is just convenience store iced tea equivalents. Basically,
yeah. I mean, they sell stuff that's this is good for your metabolism, and it is, but it's it's not like you could drink 50 of them a month and then you'll actually lose weight kind of thing, but it may have some measured growth to your metabolism. I'm pulling this shit on my ass.
Boricha, Wolf. I love Boricha.
So. I mean, I drink a lot of their stuff. They also, what's really cool about Guangdong, just from a caster perspective, is they actually give the LCK a lot of free stuff. And even though I don't think they're a direct sponsor of the LCK, so we don't like show that stuff on stream, they just kind of give it to the staff all the time. So they're always giving us like, you know, these free drinks and other stuff that we can enjoy while we're working. So that's really nice. Like I'm not even like trying to say like they're like a pseudoscience, like this company isn't real, but like they sell a bunch of stuff that's like slight health benefits. Like it's not like it's what I mean to say is it's not like medicine that they're selling at a like over the counter at the convenience store that we interact with. They do sell that stuff as well, supplements for diet and all that stuff. Anyway, huge
They
company,
sell herbal remedies is what he's saying, basically.
Huge company, massive funding, but I think they told CV Max, hey, we only are going to do a little bit of budget for this league. Can you find us some talent? Because CV Max is super famous for finding good talent, right? You look back at the Griffin roster, most of those players are still extremely relevant today. And so he found some good talent, right? I think Bull obviously had a lot of potential, right? But ultimately was probably not a good fit for this team. Leaper, streamer, seems very talented, but isn't quite there yet, right? And then you have players like Andil and Quantum who definitely could have their own like delight arcs if given the right push. Cuz is the veteran that they were like, okay, we have enough money to get one. Nobody wanted Cuz for some fucking weird reason after last year, after he was like the best jungler player, obviously. And then so they got him, right, and probably spent all the money on that. And then, you know, top lane wise, due to I feel like underperformed a lot, so probably wasn't too expensive. You know, even though we know that at his best he's really good and was like a top 3 top laner for a while. And that's like all of that is fine. Like the roster is fine. Leaper is a good pick. Like I think there's some potential there. But then it comes down to like what happens when CV Max is when he's on stage wearing the headset, because some of these drafts have been frankly atrocious. The team is not able to execute on them. Like they're putting Bulldog in a position where he has to be lane dominant when we know he can't be. They're often drafting the same draft twice and picking like a niche pick that fails miserably. The enemy team has a counter response, and then CV Max seemingly goes into game 2 being like, oh, we botched the execution, like we just run this again. And it's like very clearly not the case. Like it's very clearly the draft is weak, it has its weak points, and the enemy team knows how to counter draft.
CV Max does overcook, clearly.
But he does it like the enemy team will literally counter it in the first iteration of the draft, and then they will have a better counter in the second one as they're more familiar with it, and he runs it back. And I just don't think that he's been able to. And look, I'm a huge, I don't want to say a huge CV Max fan, but huge CV Max defender, I would say, because you have two schools of thought, like he's evil and he pushes the players too hard, or like he's a genius, right? Like I'm kind of in the middle ground. But I do think
he's an evil genius. That's what
he's an evil genius, kind of. But like, I don't think that he has been able to put measured growth onto players like Bulldog. Like, I'm not seeing it. I feel like Cuz has put in really a ton of heavy lifting on the player development side, based on how these games are going, based on the comms that we see, which we only get a small window into. But I think I'm just disappointed with what this roster had and what CV Max had and couldn't build. And it's like, it was kind of at first like, oh, well, you know, it's the Kwangno midseason collapse. We've seen this before. These players can't. But now I'm starting to wonder, like, how has CV Max not been able to solve this problem if he is so great? Like, if he is so good, then why are we still having these draft problems? And why are these players still, like, facing burnout seemingly and unable to actually cross the finish line? And I don't want to blame him completely, but I do wonder, like, why is this happen? How has this happened again? Like, if you have this insane pattern, usually you can, if you're a really, really top coach and you're a top org, be like, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. Let's figure out how to fix that. Let's improve. Because we know CV Max puts these players through the absolute grind when everyone else is going on break. And if this roster is probably going to get re-signed, and oftentimes team conversations for that start, like, right now, like the second they played the last game. And if they know they're going to basically have this team resigned, I guarantee you, CV Max like already talking like, all right, you guys might not get to see your families for Chuseok for like the upcoming Harvest Festival. Like, we're grinding. Okay, you think you've got a world's break? You don't. And like that mentality is
because his contract's expiring. Andil is contracted until the end of next year. So Cuz is probably the big one that they have to look at. So check out the other contracts. Leaper is end of this year, so he'll need to be re-signed. Bulldog needs to be re-signed. So everybody but Andil is ending at the end of this year.
So, you know, we don't know if that's going to happen, but if they are keeping this roster together, he's probably putting them on the grind set already. Or is at least making plans with the org, like, all right, like, this is who I want, and, like, do we have the money? And if the roster's...
Well, the thing is, if you re-sign Cuz, maybe, and they want to spend money, then maybe you actually do have something to potentially build around. That's the thing.
I just don't think, based on patterns, and even if you look back to, like, the Afrika days, where I mean, Afrika has a decent amount of money, obviously a pretty big org, but now they have this Kwangdong funding. They have more, arguably, and still aren't spending. I don't think they're gonna, like, build a super team or actually try to get a competitive roster with old experienced talent. They might mess around with some challengers talent, or some, like, returning Korean imports, like that could happen. But I think what I'm getting at here is I don't want to hear stories about T1 scrimmed against Kwangdong like 75 million times during the offseason with this roster, and, like, they're so great in scrim bucks, because it ultimately doesn't matter.
The fact was that last year, because Worlds was actually in Korea, it was more possible to do that. And, like, I do think that when Worlds is in your region, if you are an up and coming team, it presents a unique opportunity to practice that. So maybe because Worlds isn't in Korea this year, they won't go quite so hard.
I don't want another grind off season is what I'm getting at, and I want to see instead maybe some conceptual, like, scrims, and let's work on Bulldog's laning phase. Like, let's see CVMax, see if he can identify some of these players' strengths and weaknesses and try to hone in on that, fix weaknesses, you know, more all in on, like, Bulldog's late game play, for example. Work on some concepts for draft. And this is obviously going to be closer to next year because we don't know what the patch is going to look like, what LCK is going to look like next year. We don't know the format, obviously, but that's, like, the direction I want to see this team go, is strategic and not grinding, not just solo queue, spam games, more games equals better player, because that clearly has not worked for this team. And it seems to be, based on reports circulating around and, like, scrimbucks and, like, CVMax saying in interviews, like, that we didn't take a break, we did grinding only, that, like, that clearly isn't working, and that seems like that's a huge part of his strategy. He's a smart coach. I want him to index on, like, the intelligence part and not the time part. That's kind of my feeling, and I think he's smart enough and he has the track record to pull that off. So let's see it happen, hopefully.
All right, we are going to now, as we have finished our eulogies for the 4 worst teams in the LCK, we are going to switch gears and talk about Korea's favorite way to vote, which is only for the players on the top team, which is all pro. But before we do that, we're going to talk about Factor, our sponsor this week on the show. So if you got some wellness goals for summer, meet them in time by maybe stop eating out so much, stop making poor nutrition choices. Factor will help you with that. So even when you don't feel like cooking yourself, you'll have some never frozen, dietitian approved meals ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So no matter how busy you are, you'll always have time to enjoy nutritious, great tasting meals. They've got options like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. I had a bunch of these that were just, a grilled piece of meat, like lean meat with vegetables and, like, a carb on the side. Very good. Very tasty, much better for me than the choices I would have made by going out instead, and also just extremely easy. They have 35 different meals every week and 60 add-ons, including things like protein shakes. So it is great. Just shows up in your house in a box that's been refrigerated. So they have cooling packs in there. Put it in your fridge, eat them all week. They ship you. They change the menu. You select which options you want for the next week. They deliver you another box. It's great. So you guys can head to factormeals.com/MonteWolf50 and use code MonteWolf50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. That's code MonteWolf50 at factormeals.com/MonteWolf50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active.
Thanks for your support, Factor, and for all you guys who do use that code. It does really support us. And if you're on that CVMax grind set, you don't have time to leave your computer, Get those meals in 2
That's right.
minutes. Get them delivered to
That's
your house.
right.
You don't even need to leave your house.
When I was at MSI, when I was back in the States, and I was on the VOD review grind, Factor came in big clutch. So yes, CV Max, definitely a product for you as well. Also just great if you're, taking it to work. It's cheaper than buying your own lunch out at work as well. So there you guys go. All right. All Pro Wolf, hit me with how Pays is MVP. Hit me with
So
it.
I've actually gone back and forth on this one a lot, and I ultimately
I am
decided.
aware. I am fucking
Yeah.
aware.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I even did like yesterday, and I actually haven't voted yet. I'll probably be voting a few hours after this show. I think the deadline for voting is like 5 p.m. And normally, like the global casters sit down on Sunday, usually during the break in between series, and go like, all right, everybody, kind of like, let's talk about votes. Not because we want to collude and do the same votes, but just because sometimes somebody might be like, well, this is what I'm thinking, and somebody be like, actually, that's ridiculous. That's not allowed. You can't do that. And then you get a different perspective, right? And then
that
people
doesn't
make less
stop
mistakes.
Atlas from voting for Barrel. I've noticed.
Yeah.
You
You
had an
sometimes,
intervention for Atlas, but he still puts Barrel on that
yeah,
fucking all pro.
sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't talk full sense, but you try. But I think everybody enjoys these discussions because it allows you
Oh
to
no, they're
like.
fun.
It allows you to put your votes forward, and then see if people think that your votes are legit or not. And then sometimes you're like, oh yeah, maybe I went too far, or maybe like I need to see this from a different perspective. But we didn't really do that this season. Because everyone's like, I don't know, it's crazy, we don't know. And for MVP in particular, no one really has a direct answer, and I think the votes are going to be all over the place. But what I do know is I think most people on the global side have decided for MVP, there'll be 3 votes from 3 different teams, which I think makes sense because if your first MVP vote is for a certain player, then like you vote for a second MVP for the same team, and then you're like,
And then
well, how
Lehens
can they
gets
both be the
MVP
same?
of summer.
How can they both be the same vote? How can they both be the most valuable, right? Even though it's tiered, right? So I'm gonna vote for Pays probably first All Pro. I think
No,
he was
no,
the most
no.
valuable player on Gen G,
Stop it.
and had the big game impact pretty much in every lane. I was set up by Lehens, but like he never dropped the ball, positioning fantastic. It's really hard to vote for an 80 carry as MVP because you need to have a pop off fucking performance, because otherwise it's like, well, 80 carry just kind of, otherwise everyone else does all the hard work and then you do the pew pew damage like behind, like, well, they're tanking for you, they're blocking for you, they're getting you fed, they're letting you farm, right? I get that it's hard to vote for an 80 carry in general, but I feel like Pays' performances have been extremely consistent, and I would argue the most consistent out of any of the 5 players on Genji, which, I mean, they've all been fucking consistent. They've only lost a few games, right? But it wasn't Chovy for me. I feel like his performances overall were not inspiringly MVP. Same for Keen. Canyon is the other argument that you could have.
I mean, Canyon did like run it down during the series. They lost to KT, unfortunately.
Well, like that was just one time, so it's like actually fine. I feel like if you still vote for Canyon, but I feel like if you're voting for a Genji player, it has to be Pays or Canyon. I don't think it could be Lehens. I just don't think
Chovy.
he was MVP worthy. Okay,
It's
explain
Chovy.
to me why it's Chovy. Explain to me
Because
why
he's
it's
still the
Chovy.
best player in the league. He's still the best player in the league, Wolf. What do you want Chovy to do? What do you want him to do? Like if none of the way that Genji plays is possible without Chovy. We also know he's sharing shot calling duties right now. He is a fucking monster. He's a fucking monster. He has been so crazy even this season. He basically wins every lane, no matter what. Let's just take the game he played yesterday, for example. If he doesn't win lane, like he arguably didn't versus Zeka, he had one of the most insane Tristana performances that I've ever seen. Flashing forward to get W resets, understanding cooldowns. I have literally never in my life see somebody Tristana W buffer a Poppy ult, and I saw that. Yes, I didn't even know that was possible, Wolf. I didn't even know it was possible, and he just shows up. I mean, his game sense is crazy. Like Chovy is clearly like, okay, he hasn't had the flashiest season, but we know that because he has taken over a leadership role in this team, and he is still the axis around which Gen.G spins. And if he isn't as good as he is, this team is not good. He's the definition of the most valuable player. FaZe is a passenger on the Chovy Express, man. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, FaZe has been good, but he's not even first team All-Pro for me. Chovy's the MVP of this league. FaZe is second team All-Pro. And you know what? I changed my mind about Viper too. You want to hear? I think Viper's third team. You want to hear who I think is first team All-Pro?
Aiming.
Yes.
Me too.
Aiming.
Well, Aiming's going to be second for me behind FaZe, but yeah, above Viper.
No. If we actually are talking about players that have made the difference, sure. It's an aiming meta. Sure, he has better stats because FaZe plays Senna and aiming doesn't, right? So he's just going to come out with better stats. But stick this in your pipe and smoke it, everybody. Aiming 301 kills this split. That is over 100 more than second place, who is FaZe at 194. Aiming has had a phenomenal season, and Dplus doesn't have this excellent third place record if aiming isn't on this roster. Did he int a little bit in spring? Sure. Did he int a little bit in summer? Less so, but still sure. But is he a problem when he does int, when he turns his brain off because the entire sack of gold goes away with him when he dies? But if you want to talk about a guy who has received the resources and then maxed those resources in terms of damage, he leads the league, right? He has been the total package. And aiming is great. And if we want to talk about who is more important for this team, if I swap aiming and FaZe on these rosters, nothing happens to Gen.G. Maybe they're better. And Dplus is demonstrably worse. It's been a good I agree that aiming is a meta-dependent carry. He's always good, but he's great in hyper carry metas like this. And this has been his split.
I really like I've been pushing aiming up and up and up, and
especially because he over the last few weeks. Look, Viper has had a rough past few weeks, right? So he's been going down.
It's pretty terrible, honestly, compared to where I was saying, oh, Viper could be MVP. It was like at that moment he went down, and then like the last few weeks he went really down. But look, I agree. Aiming has been significantly better than Viper, and I've been pushing that to everybody. And I think I've convinced some people like, okay, aiming needs to be up there. But I don't agree that if you put aiming in Gen.G, like Gen.G could be better. FaZe does not get anywhere near the resources aiming gets. It still pops the fuck up. I hope you get 100 more kills if you're the only guy who can farm gold, if you're the only guy who can farm wolves, if you're the only guy who can farm red buff, if you're the only guy who can farm raptors when we get to the late game, and you have all the money, you're taking sometimes CS from multiple lanes. I do think that that's fine and that's good for Dplus's playstyle. FaZe doesn't have the game where he gets fucking caught. He doesn't have the game where he fucks up and actually...
He has the game where he can't carry with the resources. He's not the main character, Wolf.
Which games did he not carry? Which games did he not pop off on? He pops up every game with less money.
He is the NPC. Dude.
His laning phases are also more stable than aimings.
It's almost like he has a support player that doesn't change halfway through the split, Wolf. A crazy idea, I know.
You're just imagining like what things would be like if things were shit on Gen.G, but they're not. So FaZe is
I think it's amazing aiming has done as well as he has with Kellen into Moham. That's what I think.
I mean, I think I just have different perspectives on what what the first should mean based on their individual performances. Like, you know, so if like Teddy had a bunch of really good games, would you consider him instead because he has a worse team? Like, just because it's more impressive because he's on DRX? Like,
yeah, that's how I evaluate MVP candidates relative to their peers and like relative to their importance within their own team.
So,
and yes, I absolutely would say, okay, is this player, you know, first off, good enough to be on a good team, and would they shine on that good team? And second off, relative to their peers and relative to their team's average performance, like, are they being dragged down? Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't argue, you know, Teddy up to first team all pro, but like, I do think there is a spot for these players at third team, potentially.
I think that going back to we can maybe talk a little bit more about AD carry in depth when we get like down the list of like top to bottom. Just kind of rounding out the MVP discussion, though, I think a lot of people will vote for FaZe. I think a lot of people will vote for Chovy on the KR side. And I think Chovy has had it was tough for me because I thought about Chovy, I thought about Canyon, I thought about Pays, and I decided ultimately I want to do one player each team for my 3 MVP votes because we get 3. I haven't seen the form. Sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 3. This time I think it's going to be 3. I think that Chovy has also had some pretty inspirational champion pool moments, like picking the Draven, for example, in mid,
Sure.
the Zeri in mid, and making these picks work kind of basically before everyone else and or better than everyone else if it was like the second time someone has picked it. And I think that's a really big argument for him. I think Canyon has kind of been the one who ties this whole team together, but I feel like Canyon, I couldn't vote for Canyon ultimately because I feel like he only wins super hard when his lanes are all winning. Like he's the type of player who needs all of his lanes to be popping off. And guess what? 9 out of 10 times, or maybe 95 out of 100 times, that's what's going on with Genji. But I feel like he's also kind of benefited a lot from their advantages. And then like the games where he hasn't had set advantages, he's actually looked like he did last year on Dplus. So that's where I'm like, okay, I'm not sure about that. I feel like Pays to me in those moments where he's like lost lane has still actually been able to, is again rare. He's been able to actually shore that up and still play extremely well, still farm incredibly well, and hasn't really been making big mistakes. Sometimes to me, like being a good AD carry is making sure when your team sets you up, you do the damage, and then you don't get fucking caught randomly. And for players like Viper and aiming, they have been doing the first 2 parts pretty fucking well, but getting caught randomly has been an issue for both of them. Positioning has been an issue for both of them. That hasn't been an issue for Pays. So I went Pays. Second will be Peanut for me, I think, because in terms of his impact on the team and how
I think that, but
I
I think that's fair because look, you know, Viper he started out this split really strong. He did have some off games, I would say, toward the end. Doran has been insanely inconsistent this split, and Peanut has absolutely been, you know, what has driven Hanwha forward in my mind. Like he's provided a basis of consistency that has led them to a 14-4 record. Without him, you know, the kind of highs and lows of the rest of the team would cause them probably to drop more matches. I agree.
I don't know who I'm going to vote third yet, because I need a player from a different team, and that's when it gets a little bit murkier, it gets a little bit trickier. So what I'm considering doing is going Pays, Chovy, Peanut, and just being like, well, I think Chovy deserves a shout. So that's where I'm at, just to give you guys transparency for when you see my votes come out publicly, what I'm thinking. Let's move on to top though, because I think you and I have made our stances quite clear on MVP. Keen obviously is the first All Pro vote.
Yes.
There is no other legal vote. It's not allowed. No one has been anywhere close. Like if you want to try to sell me Doran, anyone, some random YouTube chat or YouTube commenter or Zeus at this point in time, then I feel like you haven't really been watching the same season that we've been watching.
No, Doran is actually like griefed so many games in summer.
Who would you put second? Like it's actually quite.
I mean,
hard.
I do think. Look, Zeus, the problem with Zeus is that do I blame necessarily Zeus for drafting decisions where it feels like T1, the style of draft that they do is to have him on like a blind pick, and like that blind pick was like TF or Kennen, and both of these have been pretty underwhelming. But when Zeus has been good, he's been really good, including like the crazy like AD Kennen game that we saw that was quite good. I will throw some other ones in there though. So I think the pool of consideration is potentially perfect because he's been actually quite stable and impressive for what I would consider a rookie. This may surprise people. Clear is it, I thought Clear was a complete bum, and I've said that before, but he had a dramatic glow up this split. Clear is probably the most improved player in the league. I will say that. And Clear, if he doesn't have these good performances, then BNK FearX probably don't make playoffs over Guangdong. Like that's very important to this roster's success. Kingen kind of low key has been all right.
Yeah.
So I still think I go with Zeus number 2. And then it's like, I probably say Perfect number 3, because again, like Perfect has been, you know, solid, but I do think there's a lot of argument for who you put in those, especially the third place position.
I do think there's going to be a lot of backlash for the global side, because I don't think a lot of people are going to have Zeus in top 3. Maybe he'll be
which is fair. Yeah. I mean, I do think there are arguments.
I don't know if he's going to make my top 3 because I'm trying to figure out where I put King and where I put Clear as well. I think Perfect has been a little bit too inconsistent for me to put him in here. Although, like, if you asked me at certain points in the season, I would have been like, oh, absolutely, he's a top 3 top laner, maybe even top 2. There were definitely periods in time where he was, but hasn't been able to find that same consistency as of late. So this is a really tricky one for me. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter to me as much like who you pick outside of number 1. So that is definitely keen, and we're very solid on that. But what you pick for 2 and 3 can affect second and third All Pro, which makes people upset sometimes on the KR side. So we'll see what happens when those votes come through. Jungle is actually not as straightforward. I do think it's still Canyon in first position.
I think it's Owner.
But Peanut and Owner both.
I think it's Peanut, Owner, Canyon now. That's what I think.
Peanut's early pathing has been game dominant for Hanwha. I think it's a huge part of why they have such a great record right now, and that's why Peanut was like in my MVP conversation. Owner, on the same note, I feel like has been really essential in T1's wins, and I feel like he's been their best player. Yes, Guma has been like their best player very recently, but I think overall, even when T1 was struggling, like Owner was trying.
Owner's been the most consistent player this season.
I agree. Like that. So, and he's been probably the third best jungler. Like I don't think Lucid. He's not. He doesn't get in that, and Pioshik doesn't get in that. So.
Unfortunately for Lucid, like Owner and Peanut have been so integral to their team's successes that I just don't think you can put him there. Especially when in my opinion, when I'm making an argument for aiming first team All Pro, like I can't say that Lucid is the reason why they are as successful as they are. Plus, I mean, obviously, if you put Peanut or Owner on this Dplus roster, I think you probably have a better team. If I'm being honest.
I think it's been pretty it's been pretty
like the problem with Canyon is he's had some really fucking disgusting games, man.
Yeah.
Like really disgusting, especially towards the end. And part of that is like first place guaranteed, happy gaming, you know, but that KT series was such a terrible display by him that it really did take me down a few notches on Canyon.
First game against T1 was a little bit rocky as well. I feel like there's a really interesting take you could have about trying to put Cuz on this list, but I just don't think when you compare him to Canyon to Peanut and Owner especially, he just can't make the list, and he's been very dominant on a very small champion pool, and we have to play the other ones. Found the same.
I think that's mostly a team problem, because if the rest of his team was more versatile, you know, he has to do a very specific job within his team, which is carry the shit out of everybody else, and so he can only do that on a limited number of champions. So,
kind of selling. I'm not putting Canyon first. Actually, I'm kind of like
dude. Look, I think if you're gonna vote for Peanut for MVP. You know, I think Peanut makes sense as first team All Pro, frankly. Like he's been more crucial to Hanwha's experience. Like for me, it's Peanut, Owner, and then Canyon. That's my top 3. But Jungle's very competitive, I will say, in the LCK. Jungle is a very competitive role.
Yeah. So you and I have already made it clear we have differences in opinion on whether it's pays first or aiming first. So we can, you know, I mean, if you want to talk about it more, but I feel like we've kind of gotten
aiming. It's aiming, pays, Viper for me in that order.
I pays aiming Viper. Well, I haven't voted yet, but that's what I have written down, and that's what my plans are currently. I don't think there's anyone else. I feel like Deft at his best could have maybe been on this list, but
he's had some stinkers, man. He's had some he has had some absolute stanky games.
I think there's a world where somebody might put Guma instead of Viper, because Guma's been pretty consistent, like even in T1's losses as of late, and then Viper has looked really rough and like a liability in some of his recent games. But when you look at the whole season overall, and yes, Viper definitely was a little bit of an Ezreal merchant for a while there. I feel like Viper has been more impactful. And yeah, we're going back to like round 1, and like anything that happened before Wolf said on this very show that Viper could be an MVP candidate. You know, he was very strong during those times. Has not been as dominant I still think warrants a top 3 spot. I'm like running through the list in my head and trying to figure out, is there another AD
No.
carry? And I think the answer is
I mean,
no.
Jiwoo would be the argument if you believe that, he was so good on Nongshim, but I mean, no. Mid lane
Well,
is
mid,
interesting
yeah,
because it's
mid.
it's Chovy. For me, it's Chovy, BDD are the clear top two. Like BDD's had an amazing season. Like KT definitely doesn't get to 50% with the other players on this roster if BDD isn't popping off all the time. Third for me is Showmaker. But I feel there are arguments here. Zeka is an argument.
Yeah, I feel like Showmaker, similar to Viper, like I feel like for a lot of the beginning of the season and the middle of the season was very good and very consistent, and he was pulling out some really cool picks. Like pulling out TF and stuff like that. But then he was pulling out Silas and coming up a little bit empty, and there were definitely some
But I mean, his picks are key to a lot of Dplus's style and success, and that made them unique, and it also got them wins.
He has been more of a facilitating role this season. You could kind of see it on his face too. Like I know Showmaker is like, all right, I'm just trying to get my boy aiming fed.
All right, they're buffing Syndra soon. Don't worry about it.
But you can see on his face when the game ends and everyone's kind of like high fiving and stuff, and aiming's like, they gave me the money and I carried, and he's kind of like, that used to be me. Like I used to be the carry, but
well, he was never really the carry. It was Canyon, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was.
He played with Canyon and Nuggery, man. Like has he ever really been the guy? Like he's a very good player. Don't get me wrong, but he has a Twisted Fate world skin for a reason. Wolf, his skin is Twisted Fate.
Yeah, 2021. I feel like he was kind of the carry when it was like a Syndra, Orianna, Lucian meta. He was pretty big.
He also has been drawing like a crazy number of LeBlanc bans, which is unusual within the LCK. So he's been very highly targeted, and it's like when you give him those champs, he can absolutely carry, and he is very dangerous. He has a weird champion pool. He was the only one playing AP mid TF in the world, and he was doing very well with it. So like for me, Showmaker, when it comes to his impact, has been really important.
I have BDD. It's pretty well known that BDD has been one of my favorite players to cast for the last 3 years. So, there's almost like inherent bias in me when I talk about what I feel about BDD. But I feel like right now, Chovy first is not negotiable, right? But I do feel like BDD is third for me, and that's because I maybe it's because I'm biased that he makes the list over players like Showmaker. But the reason why I put Zeka over him is I feel like Zeka has been more consistent overall throughout the season. And yes, Zeka hasn't been in terms of how the season has looked, there have been very few weeks where we're like, oh, it's a new patch and like Zeka's not relevant again. That could happen in Worlds, like Zeka could be patched out, because that does happen to him because his champion pool is very specific. But because it's been a meta that he's been good at all season long, and he's pretty good at the ADs. Like when it's not old Corki with package, and he could like into a top lane fight for some reason. When he doesn't have that, like he seems to be pretty good at Corki. And BDD has had some incredible stats. Like when you look at BDD's stats in round 2, his kills, his goal differences, etc., they're all like through the roof because he's had like these 3 games where the enemy team flipped at like second dragon and he got a triple kill and then took over the game. And like that BDD's game sense for how to fight those skirmishes is really good. Like, I don't want to take anything away from him. There have been a lot of games he's played where he's been like, oh, he's POG, he's popping off, he's getting these big numbers because like he was gifted a ton of money. And he's also then otherwise been playing like somewhat middling laning phases, and also had like some games where he like played Orianna in a draft where it made absolutely no sense and had a really like terrible performance. So I think he's been very good. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like Zeka has been way more impactful during the season as a whole, and in the last few games has been extremely relevant too. So nothing against BDD, but I do feel like some of the big games he's had where his opponents kind of tripping over their shoelaces. He had the Smolder game. That was a fucking pop-off game. He also had the other recent Smolder game, which was like, it was a great start. It was a great start, Monty. It was a pretty good start. But he was ulting the top lane. He was making a global impact. And then there was some positional errors and some other big problems. So I think he's top 3. And I wasn't even sure if I wanted to put him top 3 before yesterday. And I thought about it a lot. And I was like, yeah, I feel like he deserves top 3. But I don't think I can give him top 2, personally.
Faker. conspicuously absent.
Yeah, well, I mean, Faker might not be top 6 right now, unfortunately. So
That's a
I
little
hate to
harsh.
say it. I think no. I mean, I hate to say it, but like that's also extreme and not accurate. But I feel like there has to be an acknowledgement that this has
I
been
mean, in
Faker's worst
this
season.
meta, closer might be better. In this meta,
Yeah, but I mean, I think there has to be an acknowledgement that this has been Faker's worst season. I feel like in a long time, as a whole, on average, if you look at like day
yep.
one to now, he has had some really uncharacteristically questionable decision making, some very weak laning phases. Has It's not a great meta for him because he's often a playmaking mid who ends up like setting things up with Orianna ults or Emperor's Divides or is deep side laning and pulling a ton of attention on the map. So his team can either make a crazy cross map or then show up and actually have the faster rotation and set those traps. We talked about this on the show all the time. But when he's just playing Corki in the side, like that isn't the same level of threat. Like that isn't the same power, and he isn't able to make the package happen in the team fight like he would on Corki in the past because that's not a thing. Like he's not playing Azir that much because he needs to play other meta picks. He is leaning towards Azir a little bit more, and Azir's getting buffed on the playoffs patch. But I think it's going to be banned against him every single game, and it should be. Otherwise, teams are not paying attention. But it's similar to like Faker's post injury right now. You remember last year when he had his injury and then he came back and he was playing like Azir and almost exclusively Azir, and then KT eventually figured out how to ban it. I think teams will know like right from the start that they can just ban it against him and then draft around whatever else he's going to be playing. We'll see what the playoffs patch looks like. Maybe there ends up being something that helps him, but mechanically and decision making wise, this is not the Faker that I watched in spring. This is not the Faker that won the world.
Not my goat.
It's just not. I mean, it's just not. I mean, I don't know what to tell. People are gonna get upset, but like you have to acknowledge that this has been not a great season for him. It has been really rough. I mean, it almost felt like it started off with some of these all-ins, Corki versus Tristan in the mid lane where he missed multiple times, and then maybe he lost some confidence. He's clearly going through some stuff right now. I don't think he's gonna retire after this. Like, calm down, YouTube comments. But like, I do think we have to acknowledge that like it's not a good meta for him, and it has been a really rough season for him. And I think he's not going to be on most people's lists for All Pro this season, unfortunately.
All right, support.
It's
a little tough.
This one is like it could be Delight first. Like it definitely could be. And if you look at more recent weeks, I feel like if you're really weighting heavily like recently, maybe it should be. But I think I'm going to go Lehens first because
I think Lehens is such a wild card player, especially in terms of his champion pool and the fact that the Blitzcrank comes out and he is the co-shot caller with Chovy on this roster. Like for me, it's Lehens, Delight, and then I will admit some recency bias here, but Keria is probably up there. Like Keria's had some really important games, and even though yes, he's definitely had some bad games this split. It's like when he's on form, when we see those like Bard games that he has, they are so crazy good.
Yeah, I think when I was writing this down before the show, I was like, because I want to have like an outline before we talk about this, and I was like, who is it? And I wrote down Keria initially, then I was like, no, that's recency bias, Wolf. It can't be. Then I went through the list of like the other supports.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I was like, well, it's definitely not Kellen. Moham is not eligible, didn't play enough games. And then you have like, are we like talking about Andil? And then Beryl? Is it Beryl? Like, I don't think it's Beryl. So I think it is. I think it is actually ultimately.
Well, and Vital probably isn't. I don't know if Vital will be eligible either.
I think.
Okay.
I think he played. I think he's played enough. I could be wrong. I think he came in late.
But even so, it's like, is he really better than Keria? No. And the answer is no.
No. If we were to entertain the conversation of Beryl, which I think some people will, I just think that there have been equally as many misses as there have been hits from him. The problem with KT, which we will, talk about a little bit, we talk about playoff bracket, is just that on their best day, they all could be on these lists. Like even Deft on his best day could be on the 80 carry list potentially. The problem is they don't have their best day, but about 45% of the time. So, and then not even always together. Like maybe Barrel has a good day, but actually Pioshik is running it down, and then So I can't in good conscience put Barrel in here, but I think in his best games, he looked better than Keria on his average. But guess what? Keria's average was higher, and Keria's big games were also seemingly more abundant. So, and that's why T1 is fourth and KT is fifth. So I'm gonna have to. I think I'm gonna have to lock Keria in third.
I'll just about do it.
There's an argument for Delight over Lehens. I do feel, but I'm not gonna do it.
The problem is Wolf is like, so again, I am not about voting 5 Gen G players to All Pro, like first team All Pro. But here's the thing about it, Wolf. They did go 35-3. They have won, MSI. They have won the spring split. They almost had an undefeated season. 35-3 in games, 17-1 in best of threes. Like, surely I would have to say like probably at least 3 of them deserve first team All Pro if that's the case. And in my estimation, that's Keen, Chovy, and Lehens. And then I have Canyon, what I said, third, and Pays at second, right? But you have to acknowledge that probably all 5 players do deserve at least some level of All Pro given given this team's total performance. And I think given that they are setting records for wins, probably 3 of them at least deserve first team.
Well, you and I both know they're going to be the All Pro team.
Yes, all 5.
And this time it's way more warranted than when KT got it. So
yep,
I'm actually totally fine with it. And I may be voting all 5, but I haven't fully decided. The jungle one, you've kind of like sold me. Maybe it's actually not Canyon there, but otherwise it is all 4 of the other players that is in the position. So do you want to talk about playoff bracket, Monty? We're gonna get into this a little bit because
I do.
We did end up having playoffs decided. BNK got the last spot because Kwangdong lost to DRX. So if they hadn't, then actually it would not be BNK. It would be Kwangdong instead because BNK didn't beat T1. Now who knows? Maybe they would have played better if they had to play for playoffs, and it mattered more. Maybe they would have won, but based on results, it wouldn't have been them had DRX lost to Kwangdong. So Dplus picked them because that's how Korean playoff picks go. You don't actually think about strategy or anything like that. You just pick the lowest seed team, which is not surprising.
I would rather play. I think BNK has a higher floor than KT, but a significantly lower ceiling, and you don't want to get KT on a good day. That's the problem. That's the problem with KT.
I mean, Dplus did just basically bop KT in their last regular season match in the Saturday Showdown. So that would be, to me, the only argument why you would pick KT is like, well, I just beat him a few days ago. We already prepped for that. We do it again. But there's a bit of a break, obviously, before round 1 of playoffs. This season, we're starting it on Friday, actually, because of the Valorant schedule. We moved it so to compete with Valorant. So at least that's what I was told.
What a surprise. It's weird how League always has to move for Valorant, but not the other way around. Crazy that. Hey, Wolf, is it in the same venue?
No.
Oh, weird. Okay. I thought there might be some like overlap, but no, it's just, I mean, here's the thing, Wolf.
Look, it's not moved. Monty's like, no, me.
they moved. No, I'm just mad at the whole thing. They moved LCS because of an international Valorant event off of its typical day, even though the event was happening in Europe. It was happening on a different fucking continent in a different game, and they moved an LCS day.
I think, obviously, this is another deeper conversation we can have at a different time, and maybe might fit like one of our other shows here on Last Free Nation. But I do feel like obviously there is a big intent to Riot to push Valorant forward as an esport because it isn't competing viewership wise with League international events yet, but I feel like it is getting closer, right? And if you look at the domestic leagues, the viewership's been going up and stuff. So I feel like when you have a big match like the Telecom War coming up, and you don't know what the playoff matches are going to be moving into LCK playoffs, you might actually take LCK viewership away. You might take viewership away from Valorant. It feels pretty wise. Like I feel like you and I, Monty, have also talked a lot about like, why is this schedule overlapping a lot of the time? Why are they doing this during these other big events? Why are they doing this during a Counter-Strike major? Why are we do? So like I actually think it's wise to just not steal viewership from either game and compete. Like there's
I don't think
literally
there
no
is
benefit for
overlapping
them.
viewership. I think that's fake. I don't think it's real.
Okay, well, if there is even any at all, and there, by the way, I can also tell you there is overlapping production. There are people who work on both LCK production and
That's
also
the real reason. We found the real reason. We found the real reason.
Look, I think it's wise to not have it at the same time, personally. But anyway, so I just want to make sure people are aware that if you show
But
up on
here's the
Wednesday,
thing, Wolf, is that it does change this because the rest of the random day changes are what kills it because people don't know when to watch the games. And, you wouldn't assume, given the history of LCK, that there is going to be a match on Friday this week in playoffs. You would not assume that. So that's the problem, Wolf, is that the question it becomes like, if they have different unique audiences, isn't it better to just run them when people think that they're on rather than having a random ass Friday game that people will just miss because they don't know it exists?
I think from a LCK perspective, I would say like if someone asked me from an LCK perspective, if I'm like commissioner of the LCK or I'm an LCK caster, right? Somebody asked me like, do you think it's wise to move this? I would say no, because people expect to watch it on Wednesday.
Yes.
But if I am a Riot exec trying to make money off of 2 games and maximize esports profits, I would say, yeah, fucking move it. I mean, that's where we're at, right? So, I think like, it's different perspectives, right? So,
No, I
anyway,
think what this does is that it maximizes Valorant in a way that minimizes League. That's what I think it does, which may be a long-term strategy decision for them.
it could
But
be.
it is what it is.
Yeah, it's not my decision. I was told, and I want to talk about the playoff bracket because that's what I will commentate, and that's what you and I will talk about. So
Dplus poops on FearX. There you go.
yeah, I think so. The problem with B&K, and I can't say they're making a run, is because they're so binary. And I made the argument that they have so many different pick comps that they play. Like I was like, oh yeah, like Vi gets banned against them every game, but they can play other Talia comps. They can turn it just a regular engage support into like chain CC pick comps. They can play Ashe compositions. And then, the more I look at their games and their loss against T1, I'm like, yeah, but if you try to play anything else, you just get destroyed by T1. In current form T1, which again it was a great performance by Keria in the second game, but like there were a lot of other issues for P&K in that series, and I think that they're just too transparent for a smart team like Dplus, who can also play Vi. They have Lucid, right, and play those pick-based comps. So you have to ban it against them. You don't get those tools. I just feel like it's kind of just checkmate. It's a stylistically great matchup for Dplus. Even though they played really close against each other last time, it was one of the most epic series we had in round 2. I think stylistically, not going to happen. I think there is no world that B&K beat Dplus. I could have seen a world where they beat KT or maybe even T1, even though they didn't beat them in that last match, depending on how they draft. But I think best of 5 for B&K, there's just too many things that Dplus can do. And B&K only do one thing. They play pick comps or dive comps, which are essentially the same.
And they play 80. They only play 80 mid basically because of closer, which is a great meta for closer. Don't get me wrong, and they have overperformed. But I agree. I think this is going to be really tough. Also, I mean, the really crazy one is the telecom war that we have, right? Because T1 and KT split that 1-1 in the regular season across the 2 round robins. KT obviously with the big upset in the first round robin over T1. Very surprising result. But because of KT's inconsistency, it's almost impossible to tell how this is going to turn out. Like you give the edge to T1 for sure, but KT on a KT day can absolutely show up.
It's the discussions I've been having with people about this, which we've kind of mostly known that this was going to be the matchup for like a few weeks once you look at where the standings are, and you knew that Dplus was going to pick either B&K or Kwangdong, so we've kind of known this was coming. The discussions that have been happening around it have been, I can't predict KT, but I know that they can win. It's kind of the feeling, because people say it's 50-50, but I feel like it's 45-55. Like KT's best games are 45% of the time. Or maybe even like 40. And they rolled high
I'd say
against
40.
Yeah, they rolled high against Genji. And they rolled high against T1 when they were 0-4 at the beginning of the season. But they also then got pretty cleanly decimated in the second telecom war. They got cleanly decimated in the Saturday Showdown just 2 days ago against Dplus. So it's hard for me to, in good conscience, tell you guys that I think KT will beat T1. But I will tell you guys, I think it could happen. I think there's like a 35 to 40% chance they destroy them and they're having their best day, and Pushik's popping off, and T1 have the wrong draft reads, and Barrel is
Azir is banned.
mode.
I
Yeah.
mean, BDD's just objectively much better in this champion pool as well. And like, what's weird about this matchup is that when we've seen them play, like, because neither Faker nor BDD really likes playing AD champions, like we saw the handshakes into like AP champs, sometimes when they played in the past, this split.
Yeah. I think Azir should be banned against Faker this entire playoffs. Maybe it gets through like 1 or 2 games if T1 have an advantage and they're like, oh, we need to ban something else. But in game 1's like, why would you not just ban that away from him? Seems super safe. Aurora is globally banned right now.
Yes.
But as far as I know, will be available for playoffs. I haven't had hard confirmation of that.
Playoffs are on 14-16, right?
Yes. And I saw the bug list for 14-16, and Aurora was not on that list of bugs. So unless it wasn't updated, and maybe that bug was found later and it's still an issue. It's an issue with Chrono Break, by the way. Like, she breaks Chrono Break, so the reason why she's not allowed to be played is if there is an issue and we need the Chrono Break, we wouldn't be able to, so that ruins competitive integrity, so that's why she was disabled.
Yeah, makes sense.
They may have fixed that, I don't know, but I think she's going to be available. If she's not, I feel like it's really easy to slot that Azir ban in basically every time against T1. If she is available, then it gets a little bit trickier because I think Faker...
They haven't been very good with Aurora. That's the thing.
I think that Faker definitely can play it and probably has improved his play on it. I think Zayas will be a good Aurora player, and I think he had some good performances on it already. So, I'm not saying it's like I'd rather Faker have Aurora than Azir, because I'd actually rather. Well, I mean, I'm not saying that I would ban Aurora instead to give Faker Azir, because I think that's a mistake. But I think some teams may juggle that concept in their mind because obviously Zayas can still play Aurora, etc. So I assume then, moving into round 2, that Genji will pick T1 because they're the lower seeded team, and that's how teams always pick in the LCK. And also, Dplus is a team that plays close games against Genji in best of 5s. Always has. It's pretty scary to face them. I think stylistically, T1 doesn't have any elements of surprise right now in this meta. Maybe that will change when we go to a new patch, but Dplus do often have new draft reads early in a patch. They often have surprises and tricks up their sleeves. They've been really good against Genji in the past, like I said. I feel like T1 is just a worse version of Genji. They play standard, but they're not nowhere near as good. And I think Genji 3-0s them. That's what I think happens in round 2 in the top part of the bracket.
Fair enough.
Any thoughts?
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I just don't see. I think T1 has like been improving, but like I said, I think that this is a weird matchup because of BDD and Faker. But as soon as that gets into the next phase, like the question is, does if T1 and Dplus win, do Genji pick Dplus? And the answer is probably not. The answer is probably not. Like they probably just pick T1 and then just crush them.
Yeah, I feel like it's a smash, like 3-0, very, very easy.
Yeah.
And then I know this episode has been quite long, so we'll fly through some of these next matchups. But I do think Hanwha versus Dplus gets a little bit more interesting because these teams have played each other fairly close.
We'll have another episode before we have to talk about this matchups. Well, that's the thing. Like Hanwha Dplus, like you know, when we're only having the first round of playoffs, so we're only gonna have 2 best of 5s this week for us to discuss next week, and then we can talk about the matchups that we think are actually likely to occur. Because you know, again, there's always that possibility that we get the wacky ass like KT upset, right?
Yeah.
In which case, I still think Gen G picks KT because I think they'll look at their last series that they lost and be like, clearly we're not going to play like this in playoffs, and Canyon's not going to just run it down. So I think they still pick KT.
Yeah. I do think it gets more interesting for after the first round, but it gets way more interesting depending on T1's form. And I think that's the thing I want everyone to keep their eyes on when we move into round 1, and then later on round 2. Like you said, will be another episode. We'll be following the playoffs together with you guys every week. But if T1 is going to the finals, if they're going to do it again for like the 7 millionth time against Gen G, then we need to see the ramp up. Like, we need to see the ramp up. And I have people around me telling me they think it's already happening.
Yone now. It's and look, man, if it's 14-16, they're buffing his champs, buddy, or he's back.
Yeah, I don't know if he was playing Yone. He did select the champion. Did fail to ult over a few walls, and there were some interesting moments. But yeah, look, I think they need to really prove it and have a dominant win over KT. Otherwise, like, you know, it's not happening. The dream is dead. Like, they're not gonna. And for me, it's like the nightmare of having another Gen G team.
Hey man, just saying, Azir's buffed, Ori's buffed. Senna is changing into an enchanter. Actually, maybe a good patch for T1.
Senna changes do feel really good for T1. Obviously, the Azir changes feel good for Faker. But ban Azir versus Faker. Come on, teams. Like, it can't be allowed to go through. I think Senna might actually be permabanned. From what I'm hearing from talking to people, it seems like it's really strong at the moment. People are very scared of it. We'll see, but it's going to be an interesting patch. We'll know more, obviously, when we get there about what teams are playing. Still a bit of an unknown at the moment. But I'm just telling you, T1 fans, there's hope, but it really needs to start in that first round. If they have a shaky first round, I'm not going to buy into but they've always ramped up into the finals narrative this time. So, we'll see.
All right, guys, that'll do it. We will be back next week for another episode of the Monte and Wolf Show after first round of LCK playoffs. See you then.